Against at least some of the odds, it's here. It's finally here. So buckle up, everybody, for welcome to round one, Crawl Across Raid. The entrance, the MST CFXW, or as we call him around here, Blue Sky High, because he's blue and he rides sky high. Next up is a SCX10 in a horrible color. What do we call it? Well, it's Colonel Mustard. Coming up third, just going in alphabetical order here, TRX-4 Sport, fairly heavily modded. It's good old Daphne. There's Velma in the driver's seat. Next up in the list, a 95% stock TRX-4 Defender. We call it Ironsides because, well, I mean it is. Fifth in the list, another Defender, only this time around it's about 5% stock. It's Jolly Green. The sixth entrant is a energy cage and a lot of Red Cat parts. It's got four-wheel steering. It's got truggy tires. It's the Mutation. Seventh entrant, pretty much stock except for those wee baby tires. It's an Element Ecto. It's Little Yella. And last but not least, rounding out the group of 8 is a 2.2 fitted axial Capra. Four-wheel steer. We just call it Zoidberg. In this competition, there will be multiple rounds, and each round might have multiple stages. Scoring is done on a stage-by-stage basis, and scores are cumulative. Simple enough? Simple enough. On to the first stage. This is a lot of side hill. It's mostly side hill over uneven terrain, some rock, some compact rock, there's some concrete in there. Part of the last side hill section is just really densely packed dirt, and then a quick little short climb to the final gate. So let's get into it. First up through the gates, as we're going alphabetical by name for at least the first stage of the first round. Subsequent stages will be done in order from first to worst. We've got Blue Sky High tackling the side hill section, which is admittedly something that it doesn't particularly excel at. The COG is high, and there isn't a huge amount of irregularities in this area. It's mostly just stuff that tries to tip you over. But those tires and a little bit of wide track, the baby wide track I threw on there, really helps. Powers through at the end for a final time of Colonel Mustard makes some trades. The SCX10 is a little bit lower, and with its gearbox design, it holds that weight a good bit lower, but not a significant enough amount to result in a huge difference in elapsed time between what the MST did in the first attempt. The SCX10 picks up time in the steeper side hill sections, but loses time in the sections where it does get more craggy and rough, because it doesn't have the same amount of clearance, and it's got a bit more body roll even with the MST running that thin 10 weight oil. Next on the course is Daphne, who being a TRX-4 Sport doesn't have the lowest of center gravities to begin with. And this particular example is also fitted with the shocks from the Traxxas Long Travel kit, but none of the other bits. It's been tuned with shock keys to allow the longer shocks to just be all droop and no additional up travel. So she sits at the height of a typical TRX-4, but has probably 3/4 of an inch to an inch more droop at each corner. So paired with heavyweight oil, this keeps it pretty well balanced, and she can move over irregular surfaces better than most. This enables her to just edge out Colonel Mustard with a respectable fourth on the rocks is Ironsides, a virtually stock TRX-4 Defender. It's got alloy bead locks with steel center rings. It's had its bumpers replaced with some custom cut down high clearance bumpers I made out of some other TRX-4 bumpers. And the canyon trails are cut and siped. It's got some just no-name caster blocks with bearings on them, as the factory ones had gotten pretty beaten up. And I think it might have a different panhard bar or drag links, something I had in a bin. But other than that, this is essentially a TRX-4 Defender out of the box. That said, its performance over a side hill course is pretty much what one would expect. And despite all the bits and bobs that are on it, Jolly Green's center of gravity is not appreciably lower than a stock Defender's. It's just a lot heavier. So it does well or better in some instances, but this is not one of them. It was three-wheel motion all the way through this section. It doesn't really clean. I'd say the first 3 gates, it was a bit of a task just trying to keep it rubber side down. Its steering radius isn't remarkably good, as it tends to push the front end a bit. This is sort of out of its element. This is not what I would pick if I was going to play to the strengths of a heavily modded Defender. It sorts out the last section pretty well, but somewhat to my surprise, and I think maybe a surprise to others, it ends up finishing this slower than a stock. And now we can start to get weird. This is an SCX10 gearbox. The axles from a Red Cat Gen 7 Pro, 2 fronts to do 4-wheel steering. An Energy cage, I think it's the links from a Red Cat Everest 10, and the wheels are 3.8 inch J Concepts Truggy X-Cons. I think they stand about just under 5 inches tall, but most of that is rim. It really does help stop these axles from dragging on the ground as much as they want. And it adds up to a package that actually does better than I thought it would on this. Just by random chance, coming in the final pair of this stage Lil Yella, the Element Ecto, who of the group is really the vehicle best suited to this. It's small, it's light, it has a long wheelbase. This course is relatively flat. He passes through gates easily because he's one of the narrowest of the trucks. He has no problem on these surfaces, on those Class 1 tires. If the driver took a slightly better line, it probably could have saved another second or two, but not that that matters. And last up is Zoidberg. The Capra is an interesting beast because its center of gravity is higher than you would think due to the cage. And then this one's on 2.2s, Pitbull, Brave, and Berserkers, which are shorter than many 2.2s, but still, it raised it up. I was willing to make the exchange of a little bit more ground clearance in exchange of center of gravity higher. The shocks are also set up to droop. They're the lightest axial springs you can get, and with the four-wheel steer and grippy tires, it makes pretty short work of this. So let's see where we stand after stage 1 of round 1, which we'll simply call Side Hill. Lil Yella up first place at the sub 46 second time. And they trickle down pretty much as I expected. I would have hoped for Jolly Green to be faster. It was my first crawler, and it's honestly the one that probably has the most money in it. But like I say, I didn't lay out a course with a specific vehicle in mind. I just picked a course and laid it out and ran it, and the chips fell where they would. So let's move on to stage 2 of round 1. A stage which I'm calling throwing a horseshoe in a waterfall, because the route is roughly horseshoe shaped, and my neighbor saw it from over the fence and said, "What are you building? A waterfall?" And it just kind of stuck in my head because it does kind of look like a waterless waterfall. As I hope I mentioned earlier, subsequent runs will be done first to worst. So whoever is first place in the competition will tackle the stage first, and then we'll go down in order to last place running last. I find this is pretty effective on the driver as it takes any unnatural advantage away from a particular vehicle. It kind of evens things out because I've got to try it cold with the truck with the most points. So here on the horseshoe and a waterfall, this is not what the Ecto does. Lil Yella is not good at this. That rock is jagged, and it has the least ground clearance of the group by a big margin, and that's shown in the result. Lil Yella is followed by second place sitting Zoidberg, who has less, if not just lacks, the disadvantages inherent to the Ecto. The Capra has much more ground clearance. This one has four-wheel steering. The tires are tall. The suspension has more travel, as you can see right there. And Zoidberg makes pretty short work of this. Sitting in third, Daphne, being a long travel TRX-4 Sport, is pretty well suited to this. The initial section, I think she had some of the least troubles at the first rise, gets a little caught up, probably driver error. And the typical TRX-4 poor turning radius doesn't bite too much. She got hung up in a spot that I don't know if any of the other trucks got hung up. Well, I pretty much drove into that rock. Getting on to the middle of the pack, sitting Colonel Mustard, who I think will quite likely come out with a middle of the pack result here, despite getting stuck up on those first initial rocks for longer than I think I would hope. This front section is much tougher. I've sort of dabbled with this same layout but running it in the reverse direction, and it's like a 12-second run, because that northern face, which is the descent here, is much easier up, and then you can just mountain goat down the other side. As long as you don't get too crazy and flip it over, it goes easily. Next up is Blue Sky High, who's blue and sky high, and I think probably best suited of the group to this particular type of terrain. Definitely made the shortest work of that first section. Didn't require any reverse or recalculation there near the cedar wall, and aside from a little hang up right there, basically breezes this stage. Next up is Mutation, who realistically on this terrain could do great or could not do great, because this thing, when it gets hung up, the torque twist is, let's say, pretty significant. You'll see a bit of it right here. That's the good old 180 twist. But the combination of big tires, fairly low center of gravity, and four-wheel steering, and bad driving makes for a decent time. Now we're down to the 7th and 8th place setters, and my expectations were suitably low. I had doubts before passing the start line whether or not the stock Defender would even make it up this. So when it did, I was pleasantly surprised. Any performance beyond gate 1 for me was a win for Old Ironsides. It's not great at this, but it's not really made for this. So I think it punches above its weight for sure, and puts in a time that I would expect. Rounding out the group is Big Jolly Green, who I'm sure is hoping to redeem itself from that terrible performance in the first stage of the first round, and comes out pretty well, honestly. But again, the high COG and the weight that just wants to throw itself around, it turns like a boat on terrain like this, so it takes multiple steering corrections to get it where it's going to go, and that just costs time. It, I think, descends better than any of the other rigs, but it has to do it kind of slowly. So let's see how the times shook out for stage 2 of round 1. Blue Sky High excelled on the terrain which we expected him to excel. Zoidberg also did very well, and so did Daphne. Mutation was a bit of a surprise. I would say Jolly Green did redeem himself a little bit after the first, and it's a shame to see Lil Yella drop almost all the way to the bottom after that. So there you have it. Crawled Cross Raid round 1 in the books. Zoidberg sitting on top, 10 points clear of the Tide. I give him a second and a third because Daphne had 2 third-place finishes, while Blue Sky High finished 5th in the first round and 1st in the second. Lil Yella at 27 points with a 1st and a 7th. I expect more from him in the future, and then it just breaks all the way down. Unsurprising, but at the same time, somewhat saddening to see the 2 defenders holding down the bottom all the way down. I'm not particularly surprised with the placings so far after just 1 round, but we'll see what events and stages get thrown at him in the future. Could be better, could be worse. Who knows? I don't even know. I haven't even figured out what it's going to be yet. So, if you want to figure it out along with me, stay tuned for the next rounds. If anything, it'll be fun. So, be sure to like, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And I absolutely hope to see you in the next one.